Greetings, traveler. Do you hate having to write story for a game or having to design an entire tutorial sequence for teaching the players all the abilities and skills in your game? I used to be exactly the same way when I was starting my career as a game designer, but then I discovered a very simple, very effective framework for turning tutorials and stories from a bothersome, time consuming task to a powerhouse that generates essentially infinite content for my games. So today I want to explain this framework and give a couple of examples of how I use it, and perhaps this can be helpful for you as well. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 14 years now, and back when I started working as a game designer, of course I had a lot of ideas for abilities and cool things to add in my game. And like many other game designers out there, I wanted to add as many of these cool tricks, cool mechanics in the game as possible. What I found out, however, is that it doesn't matter how well I understand all these abilities and all these cool mechanics. It's all about how easily the players can understand them and how many of them they can get to use and they get to enjoy in the game. And of course, to do that, some sort of a tutorial was necessary. So having to make a tutorial for all these abilities seemed like a mountain of work for me, because even though I understood these abilities because I had made them, getting other people to understand them was a hugely difficult task for me. The way I approached it was the way it's approached in many games, unfortunately, out there, which is try to cram as much knowledge as possible, as quickly as possible into the player's mind, basically at the beginning of the game, and use very crude methods such as pop-up windows and long explanations at the beginning of the game when the player doesn't really know why all this is being explained and is not particularly interested in it either. And then in the designer's mind, you get through all that as quickly as possible, and then you start enjoying the game, which was the way I did it for a really long time. And I found out that that's just a huge waste of potential and actually of content. And speaking of content, story was exactly the same thing for me. I knew that story is generally a good thing to have, although at that time I didn't have a concrete understanding as to why that is. What is the benefit specifically of having a story in the game? And I would approach it the same way. I would write all the story all at once for a game, or I would assign it to somebody else, and all I would say is, yeah, just write a cool story about this. Of course, I found out the hard way that this is indeed the hard way of doing it, and there's a much easier way of approaching story in this case, to not only be useful for the player and enjoyable, but to avoid the cardinal sin of story in games, which is making it irrelevant to the game itself. So the story exists in a vacuum and it doesn't impact the gameplay in any way. It doesn't make the player feel that by understanding the story of the game better, they can play the game better. They can be more effective in the game and they can enjoy it more. So how did I change all that? The key turning point in my understanding of tutorials and stories was when I started encountering the problem of content in games. So sometimes, creating content for a game can be a lengthy process, but even though you put so much into the game, players can still clear the game very, very quickly. So then the question of content comes in. How many levels does your game have? How many hours of gameplay? How long is the story? How many cutscenes do you have? All these questions stand there as a means of judging of how long a player can enjoy the game. And then putting these two problems together, so the problem of creating content for the game and the problem of finding it bothersome to write tutorials and stories for games, I noticed that these two problems together actually form a solution. So what do I mean by that? When we have as designers all these ideas in our mind for cool mechanics and cool skills and abilities, we want to teach them to the player. And as I mentioned, teaching them all in the beginning of the game as quickly as possible is a rather crude way in my mind of doing it. So what if instead we did it slowly and over time? Story, on the other hand, if you write it in a vacuum, if it's not informed and it doesn't inform the player about gameplay, it could be the best story in the world, but people might think, well, why did this need to be in a game? Why didn't you write a book about this awesome story and make the game as a game instead? Which is a very valid point. So putting the story and the tutorial together, what I came up with is this. And many games do this, by the way, so it's not my invention or anything. But if instead we introduce all the basic elements of gameplay little by little, and we make sure that each nugget of tutorial, in that sense, each little teaching section of the game about a new feature or a new mechanic is wrapped in a meaningful piece of storyline, then that essentially puts in context all the content we have created in the game in the sense of abilities and mechanics. And since game designers are so good at coming up with all these cool features for the game, imagine if each one of these cool features could be converted into content, not just in gameplay terms, but also in tutorial and story terms that could provide basically infinite content for a game. So how would this work out in practice? Let's take an example for, let's say, a city building game. So one way to create a city building game, still when it's still in development, is say, okay, let's make sure that our game is fun when we're making cities. So obviously we're going to need buildings, and you have like lots of types of buildings. And then you say, well, big buildings cost more than small buildings, and then you introduce a sort of cost system. And then you think it would be even cooler if there were streets. So you create the street system. And then people, and then you have little NPC people walking around. And you think it would be really cool if we could see people leaving their house and walking to their car, and with the car going all the way to their workplace, and then walking to the office and so on. So seeing that would make the game more realistic, more cool. And little by little you add waterways and electricity and services and ambulances and so on, and you have this crazy, very, very complex city building game. So remember, still we're here in the prototype stage here. So game designers think about all these cool things to add to the game. They work together with the team, they implement all these things, and still the team understands all of it, and perhaps the development team can enjoy the game at this stage. But that's only because designers can educate the rest of the team about how all the mechanics work, how electricity works, how like all these things connect to each other. And because the team understands all that, they can perhaps all enjoy this city building game. And this all changes when a player gets the game in their hands for the very first time. So there can be all sorts of cool features in the game, but it doesn't matter how many cool features you have if players give up in the first minute or so. So here, what you often have is a very disembodied tutorial to teach you that this is how you build houses and this is how you build streets and so on. So if instead we took things little by little and we just started at the most basic building blocks and made sure that players have a little bit of fun just to start things out with just the most basic abilities, most basic features of the game, that's already a good start to get the player interested and having fun with what little there is in the game at this early stage, just after it's released, when a player is seeing it for the first time. And of course, just telling a player, here's how you build a house, now go build it, is one thing you can do. But what if there was a story reason why this player is building all this city? What if there was an objective out there in the future that the player wants to achieve? Perhaps he's the new mayor of the city. Perhaps it's a medieval city, and the player is a conqueror who is now settling down in this place. Perhaps it's a ruler of a country who is training his son or his successor. on how to become a successful ruler themselves. Any sort of story that is relevant to this kind of gameplay would serve as a much more interesting motivation for the player, not just to master every mechanic, but to give a reason about why all this is happening. And so instead of saying in the first 5 minutes of the game, this is how you build buildings and streets and trees and bushes and electricity and ambulances and all that, what if instead we took our time with all of this and said, okay, let's start with houses. This is how you build them. By the way, this is why you would want to build them. This is what the story around building houses in this way is about. This is the story behind why buildings use these materials and why they have this construction layout. So even though this is just a story reason, it informs the gameplay of the player, because we can talk about the properties of this layout and these materials, and you can really go crazy here. This is, I think, an excellent point to show off the creativity of the game designer and come up with all sorts of cool reasons why this type of house is better than that type of house, and you use it in this situation, and so on. So this is basically the very simple way of creating one node that combines both the tutorial for one of the features of a game together with a story chunk that goes with it. And then this node becomes just one node in a chain of nodes that takes you from the beginning of the game all the way to the point where the player now knows everything about this sample city building game, and the player knows how houses work and how the road network works and how all the services work. And the player, having played through this series of nodes, understands all the mechanics, has the story in his mind, because the story also makes it easier to remember what happened, because there is a logical continuation to things. It's not just random step 1, random step 2. It's first we did this, and then because of this story reason we did that. There is a logical continuation to things, so it's much easier to remember in the future. And when the player has completed all the story, he has shown mastery over all the mechanics of the game, then it's finally time to let go, to take a step back from the tutorials and the story and so on, and let the player perhaps write his own story in a free building mode for the game, or just give him an empty map with just some resources and some initial connections, some initial structures in the city, and let him this time tell his own story. But because he has all the mechanics and all the background story in his head, he doesn't need any more hand holding. He can go ahead and create his own city, and the story and the reason and the motivation for all this is playing in his mind, because he knows what we did to get to this point where we completely understand the game, and now he can go on and write his own story. So to put this again in summary, what I found out is that instead of having to cram tutorial into the very beginning of the game and trying to go through all of the abilities and all of the mechanics in the game as quickly as possible, I found that doing it slower in one node per mechanic or per small family of mechanics and was much more beneficial than having to cram it all in the beginning. And for the story, instead of writing the story in a vacuum and say, the game stands here, but the story is all the way here, and we're gonna complete it on its own, and then we're gonna add it to the game. Instead of doing that, having the story be relevant to the gameplay is a very good idea in my experience. Moreover, having the story teach the player things about the mechanics of the game is probably the best way we can use story, and it will help the player remember all these technical things about how each mechanic works, in this case how buildings work, what's good about the different size of pipes for the water network and so on. All these very technical things somehow become much easier to remember if there is a little story that goes with it. So in this case, that guy used these pipes over those pipes because there was a problem with the old ones, and so on and so on. This is a story much easier to remember than just a pop-up text that says click on these pipes to place big pipes in ground, whatever. I'm sure you've seen all these. So that's the approach I've taken in our games. This is also what I'm using to create our current game. If you're interested in that, if you're interested in discussing how we use these mechanics in our current game, and if you'd like to get involved, feel free to click the link down below to book a meeting with me and learn more about it. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time, and as always, have fun.